Kia ora tātou katoa, nā mihi nui ki te tangata whenua o te motu me tanga te tiriti katoa. Kia ora everybody, this is the panel on environmental issues and racism. And I'd just like to mihi to all of you who've come to participate, and I'll explain a few rules, but first of all, I just want to mihi to our panel, Tina Ngata from Ngāti Porou, Tuhi Bailey from Te Aotearoa me Taranaki, me Moea Armstrong tanga Te Tiriti, Ngāti Pākehā. So they're going to kōrero, and how we're going to work this, people, is that I'm the chair, I'm Catherine Delahunty. I'm going to be just suggesting a few questions to our wahine toa here who have got plenty to say. And after about half an hour of that, we'll be collecting your questions that come through the chat. So can you send all your questions to our panelists through the chat, and then myself and our moderator, Brooke, we will make sure that as many of those partai, those questions get answered as possible. And also that we have Dan, who's our technical support person. So thank you very much, Brooke and Dan. And also thank you to Stop Environmental Institutional Racism and Te Tiriti Futures people, because this is an amazing opportunity. So our topic today, our kaupapa today, is racism in the environmental movement and racism and environmental issues right across the board. And so first of all, I just wanted to mihi and to everyone, but also invite Tina to just to open our session. Kia ora.
Tēnā koe, Catherine, o te rā tēnā koutou katoa, te tuatahi, te tika me mihi a te kia rātou, ko wehe atu te pō I tēnei wātou maha. Mai tēnei pai, te kai rāwhiti, te urunga mai o te rā, kei te mātuti tonu, te whenua I ngā roi matonga a whānau, o konei te whānau ki whakiri ora mō Nani B Pāhuru. O te rā, harere hoki ngā whakaro ki ngā whānau te pai hau auru ki a parihaka koutou koto whānau me te whānau a te hikura mā I te ngaro o tō iramutu ka rere ngā whakaro aroha ki a koutou. O te rā ki a tātou katoa ngā whānau e noho nei raro I te katoa pauri ka rere ngā whakaro aroha ki a koutou katoa. Manawa mai te mauri nuku, manawa mai te mauri rangi. Ko te mauri kei au, he mauri tipu ai takuri mai te pō, ka tau mai te mauri, tihei, mauri ora.
Tēnā koe, Tina, and thank you not only for karakia, but for acknowledgement of the people that have been recently lost and the whānau that are the whānau pani across the motu. This is the hardest time for them. So thank you very much. I wondered if each one of our panelists could just take a couple of minutes each now and just talk about who they are and their relationship with this kaupapa, which is racism and the environment movement. And I just wonder if we'd like, shall we start with you? Tuhi Ao?
Kia ora koutou. Ai, me inui mai taranaki. Kia koutou katoa te motu nei. Kia koutou ki pai I rātu whenua. Ka pai koe ai. I'll just be brief. I grew up in Wellington, Lower Hutt, and ended up in university due to the good skills of my Pākehā mum. So I'm an ecologist, and from there I went on into activism, mostly with anarchists and grassroots activists in central Wellington, working on things like stopping roads, coal mining, Happy Valley, community organising, GE. And then I was lucky enough to travel overseas and experience a whole lot of Indigenous projects and community projects where people were trying to work on change and solutions to all the environmental degradation, social problems. So I've been in Taranaki now for about 12 years, and mostly trying to work with hapu and marae pā on trying to become more sustainable and get back into taio, and also to help with the mental health issues and those kind of things. And my other work really is around climate justice with the group Climate Justice Taranaki.
Kia ora. Thank you so much. It's so awesome to have like both wings of the motu, the parihaka to tairāwhiti, to whangarei, to hauraki. We're all here. Can I perhaps go to yourself, Moea?
Hi. Kia ora koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui kia koutou. I guess my origins are in South Taranaki as well, in Hawara. And I guess I should mention at this stage, my Māori name came from my dad, who was a friend of Dick Scott, who wrote, Ask That Mountain. And so my dad went with Dick for those 3 days when he first went there, and sort of joined the dots because our whānau was in conscience objector, so country in First World War and Second World War. So ngā mihi Emily, and just acknowledging the story of parihaka, and it's shaped my life. And so basically, firstly feminism from my mum, and then unionism in London. I was overseas for about a decade and was in the Journalists' Union and the women's equality kind of movements, and came home and came to treaty 1990, and probably then environmentalism after that. So 30 years as a treaty educator, 20 years in the Green Party, and so 10 years in Citizens Advice Bureau. So that's what I bring. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Tina.
Kia ora anō. He moko puna tēnei no te tairāwhiti, so ko hirangi te maunga ko waipu te awa ko Ngāti Porou te iwi. I live in Wharekahika on the East Cape, and my hapu te whānau te whakiriora, te whānau a Himerite, te whānau a Karuwai. And I did spend some time in Pōneke and in Papaioea, and studied public health there, and came to work in the field of environmental health through the School of Public Health, and also worked on Pā Mason jury study on Māori households ko te hoi Nukuroa. And it was through that study and through my, I guess, some of the conscientisation that happened through the people that I was exposed to there that led me to really understand a lot of these different perspectives, start to make sense about the clashing perspectives between what I was taught and what was gifted to me through my whānau and everything else that I was coming across in university. So I was really thankful for some of the whānau around me at that time, Nanny Juliet Paiapa, Bob Yonke, and Pā Mason, who helped me to pass a lot of that out, and also to understand some of the inherent racism within universities and academia as well that led to some of those conflicts. And so from there, I came home. I came home and started working on my marae, delivering programs and courses in relation to taiao and environmental issues. And I have been living at home since then for about 7 years now. And I work at a hatu level with my own whānau, and at a national level on some other issues to do with constitutional reform and colonial racism in Aotearoa, and at an international level with my Indigenous brothers and sisters around the world seeking justice within our global Indigenous village. Kia ora.
Kia ora. I'll just briefly, because in the spirit of whakawhanaungatanga, I'm the chair, so I'm not meant to talk, but I'm Catherine Delahunty. I'm from Hauraki, of Irish English descent. I'm 150% Irish and 10% English on a good day. And I have been working in the environment movement for a long time, and my my preoccupation, hence my suggestion to Dr. Hedekame that we have this kōrero, is I see the environment movement as needing to examine itself deeply on issues of racism. So I'm hoping that these wahine tour today with their experience will help us commit to that examination so that we can actually live in the spirit of Te Tiriti. And there is no other way that we're actually going to protect the environment except by standing alongside and behind tangata whenua. So having had my say forever, I wondered if we could start. The first partai that we wanted to talk about was what makes environmental movement racism different in specific ways from the generic racism of a colonial society that we live in. So I just wondered if anyone had any thoughts about what you've struck in your mahi, in your relationships and your experiences of working on all these kaupapa, what's specific to the environment and resource management, that kind of thing. So I wonder if I could just, ignoring some things that aren't positive, but going for the positive analysis, let's have a look at what makes that different. What makes the environment movement or the regional council or whoever more inclined to a specific type of racism? It has certain characteristics. Anyone want to have a go on that one?
So just looking at those interesting chat messages, it's kind of hard to ignore. Yeah, I can start if you want. I mean, there's several things. I think some issues are more prominent now in some communities and less in other communities. I think in Europe, they've got a long way to go to catch up.
Yeah.
So specific things are the overpopulation arguments and, sending in people to Africa, the poor countries to control their populations. Not acknowledging mātauranga Māori as an actual science, as actual, thousands of years of observation. And I mean, at university, I had one class in 4 years on Māori science, and that was in the science degree. And still it was kind of mocked. That was a while ago. And then there's just little things like always getting Māori to do karakia at some council hui at the last minute, as if it's just this thing you tag on without thinking about the whole tikanga process around it. Cultural appropriation, that's biggie. And then things just like in environmental campaigns, people always like, well, we're the Māori, why aren't they here? Why aren't they talking? And it's people not realising all the other pressures that Māori are under with poverty and mental health and all the other stuff. But I'll let the rest of you keep talking.
No, kia ora, that's awesome. Tina, did you want to throw anything in about this kaupapa?
Sure. So, I'd first of all just thank you very much to the moderators. I hope you're able to eject some of the people who are evidently triggered by strong wahine talking about truth in Aotearoa. And I mean, really, all I see is some people who are being triggered by the truth. Hāpai. I think obviously environmental racism exists in non-colonial contexts, and I think there are some of the cases overseas that I can think of, particularly where communities of colour, for instance, on Turtle Island, where communities of colour have been subjected to dumping toxic waste on their communities, and just the general assumption that communities of colour, our lives and our well-being are worth less, and so often abuse through the environment will be visited upon communities of colour in that way. And the same thing happens in Aotearoa here, where we have communities of colour that aren't necessarily Māori, but they are subjected to abuse through the environment, either through the dumping of toxic waste or lack of access to clean environmental resources, or a lack of agency over what's happening in the environment around them. Or simply being shut out of discussions to do with the environment because of race. So I do think that some of those discussions exist probably outside of a colonial context, but within a colonial context, and we are the vast majority of the time in a colonial context in Aotearoa because it's a colonial state. Certainly environmental racism fits within this experience of colonial racism. And I think, one of the things that I've noticed also is that environmental and colonial racism, within a colonial state, environmental racism is very difficult to get the colonial powers to address, largely because the economy is based upon it. And so they'll address a whole raft of other kinds of racism before colonial states will address environmental racism, and largely because the power system and the economy rest upon that racism as well. And so I think those are some of the, when I've noticed that our own colonial government has wanted to understand racism, they generally stop short of looking at that intersection of colonial and environmental racism, which is the dispossession of Māori land is one of those core issues, and the return of our right to self-governance on our own land. So there's just early insights on those two issues.
Fantastic. Just before we go to Moea, I'd just like to say that Dan, our moderator, and Brooke, our moderator, and Dan Arteki are working on removing the offensive threatened kōrero from this wonderful panel. So we'll just kia kaha everybody, because this is just an example of how it is. And
it's an exact example of how it is, and we want to
it's almost like I almost felt like I was in a movie. Yeah. Anyway, over to you, Moea.
Kia ora. Just building on what these two have been saying, absolutely. And I think how it differs is that, my people, Pākehā, Tauiwi, when they get into understanding ecology and the environmental movement, it's usually, certainly for people older people, they usually come to that before understanding indigeneity. And so I think that's kind of the problem, going right back to Rachel Carson, Silent Spring, that was in the 60s. And I think the Gaia theory, like Lovelock, was only in the 70s, I think. Mm-hmm. And so you can see that it's almost like we're pretty new for my culture to actually talk about it. It's really only been 50 years, 60 years. And so it's sort of like a little bit like nouveau riche, it's like nouveau aware. And so then people get it and just feel like they've got to save the world, like they're now on a mission. And so, and then they may, over time, they might get introduced to indigeneity and Indigenous people's rights. But by that time, it's too late. They're already on a mission, and everything else is irrelevant. You know what I mean? So I think that's kind of my generation's, experience. Whereas I feel quite lucky because I understood indigeneity before really going hard actively in environmental movements. And so I was looking at that from almost a different framework. So I think that zealotry, that amazing focus, especially for Tauiwi who have settled here because it's clean green New Zealand in the last 20 years or so. Now, can be both ways, of course, but obviously very focused.
Aye. Kia ora. Thanks, everybody. I think it's very easy to look at it as just generic, but I think there's some very specific things. And those of us who are trying to challenge racism in the environment movement, there's some very specific memes that you've all mentioned that actually need to be, those myths need to be taken apart by people like myself and Moea. That's our job. So I'm wondering whether people have, I'm not going into the questions right now, but people have mentioned the fact that you're forced, if you're in this country and you're in your rohe, to deal with local government and regional government and the Crown. And I'm interested in your thoughts on how do you think both environment groups and local and regional government, how do they maintain their power from a racist point of view? How does it work so that they actually maintain their power? So I wonder if you wanted to have anyone wanted to talk about their experience of dealing with environment groups or local government in this way, and how their racism benefits them and their decision-making power. Anyone want to have a bash at that? Stories are good.
I can start. No,
okay.
I guess, with the Crown, government and council, it comes down to the treaty as opposed to Te Tiriti. So, that's huge. Like, there's the principles that weren't agreed on, and just the whole way government's run by those who are able to be politically active. So those who are richer and more educated are more able to speak. So when we have elections, how many Māori stand in Taranaki? I think we've got one Māori on one of our councils at the moment, maybe one on another. We're just constantly outnumbered because of white privilege, basically. And then the same, with the whole settlement process. Iwi have been forced into setting up iwi authorities, which come under a similar kind of decision-making process where it's a few speak for the many, and hapu's voices are often drowned out, and it's open up for corruption and heavy kind of administrative costs and all these kind of things. It just causes a lot of problems. And of course, the RMA is a huge one for environmental stuff. It's a huge demand on our people to constantly be keeping up with all the applications that come in and having to answer them and deal with them. And you can't just say no, because then you have to end up going to court often. And there's, I know for where I live, there's no funding for that. There's no requirement for applicants to actually fund iwi to deal with their applications. So the council get money, but we don't. And it's just a huge stress on our people. As far as groups go, I'm lucky enough, I guess, to have not had such bad experiences for the groups I work with. And maybe it's because I work with groups who are more radical, I suppose, more grassroots, more conscious. But I do know with, say like Extinction Rebellion, for example, what you're seeing coming out of Europe from them is pretty terrible when it comes to acknowledging Indigenous rights and knowledge and, wishes to speak. But I think the New Zealand groups are trying to counter that. It's a bit slow, and we've got there's a lot of new activists popping up who haven't been educated in this, so it takes time. But there's Pākehā there who are willing to take that on, and there's Māori working with young Māori who don't understand as well. You just have to be patient. But I'll hand it over to the other.
Kia ora. One of you, other wahine, like to comment on the sort of local government, local group racism and how it can be dealt with? Like Tuhi has given us a steer, because remembering that there's huge benefit to environment groups and local government when they don't share power. Moea, you're looking like you do.
I think having done workshops with staff and very, very occasionally the councillors in local government, I think there was somebody in the chat said a local government doesn't have treaty responsibilities, and I would dispute that. I think the Crown is the matua, but the local government are, the taina, and they're connected, and under, there's even within sort of kawanatanga, if you look at it all as kawanatanga, there's tiny amounts of tiriti scattered through, you know, the like Local Government Act and the RMA. But for the last 20 years, I see that the situation for iwi resource management units is exactly the same. I worked for Ngāti for about 4 years, and we got some gains in the early 90s, protected some things, Munguru Sandspit, for example. And I think we got a bit of a head of steam up and thought, oh, we could, you know, this new act, the rights of ecosystems, you know, world-beating legislation, so we can work it and do this. And then, of course, got absolutely trummeled, you know, when you take on the big business interests, absolutely beaten up. And now my son, one of my sons is doing the same mahi now, and same issues, different people, same issues. So there hasn't been any kind of structural change in how local government operates, and it's because I think that the councillors have been up to maybe this point have been predominantly white men, and it is just not in their purview to go to a workshop. So, you know, even when I've had workshops for councillors have been scheduled, less than half will turn up. And as soon as I realised that at the beginning of the workshop, I think, well, yeah, we can do this, but actually, unless you're all on board, and it will not filter down to the staff. And I just want to say briefly about one particular, well, you know, doing local government staff, and what Emily was talking about, treaty or tiriti, still they don't know the difference. Okay, still. So, you know, basically the education movement, we failed. But even if we are on, you know, the English text, which of course they always go, well, we just staff and we have to follow the RMA. And I say, okay, so which of the principles, tell me the principles that you're operating under? And none of them know. I mean, because there's 5 different sets of principles, so it's not surprising that they don't know. But, you know, they are bound to operate to, you know, what's the fuddy-duddy words? You know, the Conservation Act was the most stringent, you know, give effect to. That was the beginning. And then after that, it got watered down to, you know, take into account all of those widgy-wodgy, fuddy-duddy, lesser than give effect to. And so they don't even really know what even the principles that they're supposed to be operating under. So just saying that. Kia
ora. Tina, have you got some thoughts, Ehoa?
Yeah. Oh, I've got thoughts.
I thought you might.
So obviously, you know, here in Te Tiriti, we've just come off the back of the 250-year celebration of Cook's arrival, and within our own local government, we had an issue arise where one of our local councillors had been overheard by another councillor to say that Cook didn't kill enough Māori when he first arrived here. And from that unfolded a series of issues and investigations and questions and challenges to our own local government to deeply investigate the role of racism in our local government decision making. And the response to that was that there would be training, Treaty of Waitangi training for all incoming councillors. Now, I don't ever want to you know, dissuade anybody from understand. Of course, we all need to understand the importance of Te Tiriti, and I'm very purposeful when I say te tiriti rather than the treaty, and understanding the prevalence that should hold over principles as well, understanding the provisions of te tiriti o Waitangi and why it's important to do that. That said, I think the role of racism goes deeper and requires a different level of understanding as well. And understanding te tiriti o Waitangi can often be a handy vessel for understanding the role of colonial racism. But racism is so pervasive throughout our society. And it's also, people are very defensive about it as well. And they take it as a personal slight if you suggest that racism plays a role in their decision making. And so it's very difficult to get people to move past that sense of personal offence and into this idea that we actually all have a responsibility to deeply investigate the role of racism, because as Moea pointed out, it's very recent. It's only in the last few decades that we've started to understand the dynamics of racism in society in general. It's only in the last couple of decades that we've started to understand the role and the history of imperialism in setting up the power structures that sit everywhere around us. It's still very early in the game. And so there isn't, people generally who are occupying council seats these days, I agree, have largely up until now, is starting to see a bit of shift, but have been older white men, and largely they have come from a settler space. They're farmers who have acquired their land from their fathers who are farmers, from their fathers who are farmers. And so even from the inception of councils, many councils were incepted as groups of settler farmers who were brought onto land that was often dispossessed through the Māori Land Court and subject to racist and imperialist legislation through our settler government. And so the councils still carry that legacy of settler colonialism from their inception, and the way in which power, only ever cedes to its own kind. And so its own kind has inhabited those seats that have largely determined the flow of benefits and the use of our environment and natural resources all the way up until now. And that became very apparent in the way that some of these, that one of these and a few of these councillors held their attitudes around Cook and some of the issues that happened there. So all of these things are kind of, built upon assumptions. They're assumptions about the beneficence of authority, that people who sit in these seats must be automatically of a good nature and excellent character, and so that therefore must cancel out the fact that they are racist. They've been voted in by their constituents, and so it must be a fair democratic process. And so without a deep investigation of how racism and colonialism plays into how they have acquired their power, then we won't understand how that power dysfunction, or how that unequal apportion of power is maintained through the way that they hold it. And so I believe all councils need to have a thorough investigation of the role of racism, in addition to investigating, and we're not even at the stage, I don't believe we're at the stage of understanding the depth of Te Tiriti o Waitangi, and I don't think we do that very well. But on top of that, I think we also need to understand the pervasive role of racism and what it plays, and we need to put our egos to the side when we do that and accept that it sits within the vast majority of us as well. And so I would just say that in terms of local groups and NGOs, I mean, many of them also operate under these same assumptions that if you have good intentions, you can't possibly be racist. And it's a really difficult, and I think possibly one of the terms that I've heard used the most around the world to excuse an act of racism is, well, their intentions were good. But as if intentions somehow are more important than the issue that winds up denying us well-being and our lives as well. And so we need to put all of that to the side, regardless of whether in local government, NGOs, and deeply investigate the role of racism in our decision making and behaviours and assumptions.
Kia ora. Thank you all three of you for your awesome kōrero. I guess just one comment I'd just throw in is in the environment movement as opposed to local government, I notice a lot of people want to work with tangata whenua, which sounds healthy and good, but often it turns out what they mean by that is when they can see hapu align with what they think should happen. So, oh great, the Maoris have joined us, so now we can use them to win our case. I have literally heard that said in the environment movement, and I've also heard it expressed in more sophisticated ways, rather than a recognition of Article 2 rights. So that's why I'm so fired up about this issue, is that we have to unpack in the environment movement just how manipulative we are to try and get what we want and make use of the relationships that should be built in good faith. I just wanted, but before we move to questions, and there's quite a lot happening from all over, positive questions, I just wondered if any of you had a story of something where you've experienced a positive resistance to environmental racism, or a successful coalition, or a respectful non-majoritarian approach, where you've seen it work, so that we can think that we can see how change is possible. Any thoughts about, because I think you've laid out the situation very clearly, especially regard to local government power and the insidious racism across society. So any stories of where you've seen it disrupted in a positive way?
I suppose I'd like to think of 2002, when the Green Party, who were predominantly Pākehā Tawiwi, changed the constitution to include, as an overarching statement, the party's commitment to Te Tiriti. And as far as I'm aware, it's still the only predominantly Pākehā party to have that encapsulated in its charter, which is like our constitution. A big win in 2002. Sorry, I haven't got many examples after that. Although I think that G-free movement's been pretty good, certainly in Northland here, has reached out considerably.
Kia ora.
So, but apart from that,
I would say, I mean, I have to give props to Tawiwi Mō Matike Mai.
Right.
You know, if we're not going to be, if we are, one of the issues I think with colonial racism in general, and within this context of environmental racism as well, is that we need to have a clear vision of what justice looks like, and often for us, for Māori, or for Indigenous peoples in general, we get caught up in putting out so many because of the power system, the racist power system that sits around us. We get caught up in putting out so many fires of injustice around us all the time. You stamp that one out, another one pops up. You stamp that one out, and you've got all your hands always putting out all of these fires of injustice, and it leads to fatigue. You wind up with hui fatigue, you wind up with action fatigue. So many people I know have missed out on spending quality time with their children as their children were raised, because they've been fighting for rights for their people, for their children to have a better future. And so you know, having a clear vision of what justice looks like is so important in order for us to not get caught up in the politics of distraction that colonial governments are so excellent at perpetuating. And so for me, you know, that vision of justice really is what the Matike Mai constitutional reform kōrero is about. It's about understanding what justice looks like in an Aotearoa perspective, and how that would filter down to our environmental rights and our reo and everything around us. And so Tawiwi Mō Matike Mai, to me, are a really valuable group, and I really valued their support last year as well, through the Kia Mau movement, and how they came to support us in opposing the Cook celebrations. I think, you know, when I've seen it done well, allyship is very humble, and it knows to pass the mic over. It knows when to step back. It doesn't assume in a paternalistic way that it knows better or that its role is here to save us. And so I think there have been times where I've seen some of that done in the United Nations space. There are groups like DOSIP who really are just there to serve Indigenous peoples at the Permanent Forum, and some of our other non-Indigenous allies that come to the place there specifically to serve. Within that context of imperialism also, I want to say that there's a really interesting story. I do have some really interesting stories about these discussions about the doctrine of discovery, which non-Indigenous people can find very confronting and difficult to engage in, often because they have a hard time facing a sense of guilt about what's happened as a role of their arrival into where they are. And so, and it's I find it really interesting that the doctrine of discovery is delivered and applied through the yoke of the cross and the crown. Those two words are very prevalent in its application, and the crown can often be the most difficult to deal with. But I've actually found the cross, that religious groups have had some of the most profound conversations with me about their role in imperialism and the dispossession of Indigenous lands. And one group is the Methodist Church in New York. Every year give up their church headquarters to Indigenous peoples across the road from the United Nations to have a safe space to meet, to hold their markets, to fundraise, to rest. And that's in recognition of the role of the church in the dispossession of Indigenous peoples from their lands. And the Mennonite Church also has invested a whole heap of time and money into providing support and education resources for their own. And that's another, I think, really important role of allies, is to work with their own so that we can work with our own, because we've got a lot of work to be doing with our own people. We don't necessarily always want to be putting our energy into helping non-Indigenous people understand their own roles.
Kia ora. Yeah,
Just wanted to there is some positive stuff, and I always make a point of trying to end a workshop on just naming some of the co-governance stuff that's happening as part of the treaty settlements. I mean, I know it's a compromise in terms of tangata whenua and Te Tiriti, but it's always good to know that there are some things, in some settlements that are moving towards what we might be looking for, Te Urewera, Panganui River, some things like that. But I do not know, because I haven't heard from the tangata whenua involved, how truly that is a shared decision-making as it's working out in practice. So, but there's always something positive. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Just before we go to, I'm not going to be able to ask all the questions, but Tuhi, do you want to say anything about the strategies you've seen working, or collaborations that have been genuine in Te Tiriti?
I guess second a lot of what Tina said. It's really good to see activist groups in the recent years putting up Indigenous people to speak, people of colour, helping them get into little videos that are made as promotional educational tools, and just being more conscious in general. And also just seeing environmental groups going to support Māori campaigns, like the number of people that went up to Ihu Matao, the working of Greenpeace with Te Whānau Apanui and other groups was a refreshing thing to see after a long time of that not happening. And I suppose one thing, this might actually be a question for Tina, is I heard that there's a council, the Gisborne District Council, that's given iwi reps for, I think it's 9 iwi, so they now hold like 50% of the council and they get power of veto. So, if we had that in all our councils, that would be amazing. Not sure. There's one iwi rep from there, I thought she said. But that would be cool if it could happen. And I don't think it's such a, unthinkable thing. If we're thinking of mana whenua, Māori are here for good. We care about our people deeply and the environment, so why not put them in charge? Why not give them power of veto?
Absolutely, I agree. We don't actually have iwi reps on Gisborne District Council.
There's another council up that way. I forget
Yeah,
what.
it might be. I think down in Hawke's Bay. I think they have iwi reps in Hawke's Bay and Wairoa.
Aye, they do.
But not. We actually we did put it up for discussion, and it was voted down that we would have iwi representation. And so there's a local leadership board. We don't have rights of veto. And then we have some joint management and co-governance agreements, which are still in the stages of being implemented, I think, and fleshed out. And again, the barriers to that are largely the assumptions of the Crown and local government that ultimately they have the right to veto, that ultimately any rights that we have are rights that they can gift us and accord us, but they'll exercise their paternalism as to whether or not that's in the greater interests. And so that in itself is an assumption of supremacy and superiority. And so even with our co-governance agreements, they still labour under the persisting assumption of colonial supremacy.
Interestingly, I was in the room when it was first put up. A carefully crafted komiti of tangata whenua and tai rāwhiti approached council to create this kind of relationship, and the mayor had the casting vote, who's now the current race relations conciliator, and he voted it down on the grounds that he could speak for Māori. And that is, I know he's doing a good job on some things, but I was in the room. I know what happened, and I actually feel quite deeply that the people had done an amazing job to create something that would have worked for the benefit of all, not just the benefit of Māori, the benefit of all. However, we're running out of time, and I haven't asked you all these really amazing questions, so I'm going to have to just choose a few. So there's people raising really interesting issues here, such as when the whanaunga advocate the selling of water rights, but also are very strong, appear very strong in tikanga. You know, how do they work out how to deal with that? That's a very interesting question, which is not a question for Pākehā. But I guess that's if anyone's got any reflection on the pressure that's happening, say for example around selling water rights, how do you challenge your own is always a question. Does anyone want to comment on that? Don't worry if you don't. We've got plenty others.
I mean, it's largely those kinds of questions sit still within a colonial paradigm. The driver of us to sell water rights still sits within a colonial paradigm. And so, you know, all of us, and again, this comes back to the politics of distraction. It would be great for us to be able to sit down and wānanga, you know, what our collective principles are and how do we get on the same page around how we move forward on this. But at the same time, we have these multiple other fires of injustice that we're putting out as well. And so, you know, how I tend to, and I'm talking from a Māori perspective, I'll let others talk about how they talk to Pākehā about it. But when I'm talking with my own about it, I like to try to get us to consider what would our decision be if we were sitting in a sovereign space. If we were sitting in complete sovereignty, what would that look like? And then what would our decisions be based upon that sovereignty? And then how much of that can we carry over to the decision that we need to be making today? And I think we need to try more to position out. We often, and I saw this a lot last year as well, we often are very swift to give up hope on sovereignty or to become despondent and make a decision and instantly assume or accept our colonised state. But I think if we can bring ourselves back consistently to what would our decision be if we're in a completely sovereign space and then start the discussion from there, that can often lead to a different outcome.
Kia ora. Rather than everybody comment, I might just throw another question and someone else can grab it if that's okay. Thank you so much, Tina. The question, what do you think is the commonality of experience between poor white communities and communities of people in colour in terms of environmental struggle? And what do you think are the differences that racism makes between those poor white Pākehā or white communities and communities of colour? Does anyone else want to have a go at that one?
Yeah, I'll have got this one.
Awesome.
this is a thing that pops up all the time where, you know, people like Donald Trump will use the working class and the underclass to attack other underclass groups, typically brown coloured. And yeah, it's shocking, it's terrible. But I guess we just have to be aware of what's actually happening when people do that, how they're using one group against another group who are under them, and help, you know, the white underclass poor see this so that they stop doing that. And also to help them understand how they fit into the whole picture of being, in a way, colonised as well. Like, say, with the Irish being pushed out here because of the famines and the, you know, the civil wars and that kind of thing because of England, and just trying to draw the similarities between Indigenous colonisation and working class before.
I'll just make one quick comment on that as a person from an poor Irish background, is that we were taught to be racist. We were taught that we were the bottom of the heap, but there was someone even worse than us. And that's always the opportunity for divide and rule and scapegoating. Scapegoating works very well when communities feel that they are not getting what they're entitled to in the West. You just scapegoat by blaming some people of colour. It's a classic. However, we'll keep moving because there's lots of really good questions here. This one's about climate change, and it's a little bit off the topic of racism, but I think it's an interesting one. Do we have any thoughts about a tikanga and Te Tiriti-centred approach to climate change displacement, e.g. relocation of Pacific peoples and other threatened states? What would that look like for Aotearoa? So that's like a whole other webinar, but I wonder if anyone had anything they'd like to say about that. How we might approach that in Aotearoa.
I'll just say it just briefly. I think given that our relationships with tangata moana predate Te Tiriti or Waitangi, I think there's definitely room for us to consider our rights and responsibility relationship with tangata moana in a separate space to Te Tiriti as well. So I think Te Tiriti applies to everybody in Aotearoa, but given that it is meant to cover everybody who arrived here off the back of tangata tiriti and specifically the British and our tangata moana whānau were arriving well before that. And given that we have whakapapa relationships, I think that should underpin a different kind of discussion to the relationships that we hold with wera atuonga tangata tiriti.
Oh, kia ora. One other hātai which I think is really interesting is about rahui. So the person is asking about the practice of rahui, and it's relevant to this kōrero around racism. So I'd be really interested if anyone wants to talk about that, because we're in a rahui right now, but most Pākehās think it's a lockdown. So I think it'd be really interesting to how you see rahui. Is it a key tool?
Are we in a rahui? Are we in a
That's
rahui?
what someone told me. That's what someone told me. We're in a rahui. A number of people. I'm not in a position to.
I don't remember anybody saying a karakia over our rahui. Rahui has very specific practices.
Yeah.
And I think we need to be careful with that, because I often see council putting up signs that there's a rahui on, but they haven't engaged with mana whenua first and foremost about that rahui, and they use the word rahui, but they don't understand the tikanga of rahui. And so rahui comes with a very specific set of practices, and it's grounded in a very localized space. And so and a perfect example is when whānau Apanui established their checkpoints for the COVID-19 control checkpoints. They did a proper rahui with karakia and the proper practices and protocols. And so I think we have to be really careful about the way that rahui is, the word rahui is utilised. And so, and then certainly it's not respected by local authorities or commercial groups in the same way that that Crown law is, or Crown policies are, and they're not enforced or resourced to be potentiated in that way, which is just another manifestation of environmental colonial racism.
Perfect explanation, and great reminder. There's one more question here on white fragility. What are your thoughts on addressing white fragility as a form of white privilege by law and policymakers? There seems to be an emphasis on cultural competency training with judges, etc., which seem to pander to white people and assume their best intentions. Says that Kōrero again about best intentions. But should there be a movement to get institutions to move towards anti-racism white privilege training? Moea, you might have thoughts.
Yes, absolutely. What I find really, really effective in the workshops, and I want to acknowledge Tina's work on the Doctrine of Discovery and, you know, the divine right of kings and all that, is, and we've always used that triangle model of the British on the top of the triangle, you know, British is best, all the rest of it, you know, and the French down the bottom. And then, you know, all the other European countries in the middle, and then Indigenous people as a separate layer, not connected to that triangle. And I find that really, really quite powerful for Pākehā, and then you thread it throughout the whole workshop as saying, okay, you know, the triangle in our heads is 500 years old, you know, good luck with dealing with, you know, trying to be anti-racist, because it's practically in our genes, you know, after 500 years that the British are best. And every now and when you get that image of that triangle, and whenever anybody starts operating from that triangle, all you've got to do is just go, oh, so is that coming from the triangle, do you think? And it's just a good tool because it is 500 years old.
That's awesome. Those tools are helpful. And there are quite a lot of questions that we haven't got time to address with 4 minutes about education. So that's, you know, a clear steer that there's more and more work to be done. And also to ngā mihi, to everyone who's creating through your activism the tools and images and ideas that we can then take into challenging our people. I wondered if we could give everybody a last word, because we've got to stop at 3:30. So I wonder if I could start with you, Tuhi. If you've got anything that you'd like to say as a final, I mean, this is a huge topic. We've only just started on racism and the environment movement, and anything you'd like to say as your final kōrero?
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to compact it into 1 minute, but something that struck me with working with a council staff member in our regional council is we were talking about environmental baselines for monitoring. And they always go from whenever they started, which is, you know, the 80s or the 90s or whatever. But I'm always trying to say, well, why aren't we looking at Indigenous baselines, how it was when it was sustainable, or, you know, way more sustainable than this? And they just always laugh it off as, well, why don't we go back to the age of the dinosaurs? Blah, blah, blah. And I guess you know, we've got a long way to go. We've got to work with council staff, council CEOs, like where we are. You know, can talk about councillors who are voted in, but actually most of it's run by the people who work in there behind them. But I think the environmental groups are making some good moves, but it's mostly government.
Kia ora. Thank you so much, Em. Tina, have you got any last wero?
I guess, you know, I would say that for those who are working in council and for those who are in NGOs or environmental groups, in many cases, not all, but in many cases, you will have a sense of justice. You'll have a sense of commitment to community somewhere in there. And so, you know, I would say that for everybody in an Aotearoa context, it's incumbent upon you to understand the history of injustice that sits behind your organisation and your region and this country, and then pose yourself the question, at what point in history and when was that justice ever overturned? What act was ever taken? What investigation was ever done to overturn the injustice that underpins our society as it stands in the moment, and there hasn't been. So with that answer in the pot, what are you going to do to start to address that injustice? And it goes beyond the treaty. It includes the treaty, but also will require deep investigation and inquiry into the role of racism and discrimination. Kia ora.
Oh, kia ora, Tina. Moea, last word.
Echoing, I think New Zealanders are totally, you know, at the end of a workshop, 99.9% of people get it, and they don't. It's not okay you know, the situation is not okay. So I just think education, and the setting for us is fair go, and I, you know, we just have that lack of information. Just want to say one more thing. I don't like the idea of, you know, have to say it, Māori seats on local government, because to me that institutionalises minority status, and it's not the kind of Tiriti contract kind of status. And so, you know, I think that we need to build up the relationship and encourage councils to have that kind of relationship with the group of mana whenua, however, whatever that looks like, to have that relationship rather than go for minority status enshrined in the Māori wards.
Kia ora, you got your last word in? We're just about done. I just wanted to say, ngā mihi nui ki te whānau o wāhine toa. I would just say to our people out there, from my culture, listen to what these women are saying. Listen to what's behind them, the people they step, the shoulders of their tupuna. Listen. We need to look in our mirror and reflect on who we are and who we are not, and just to whakarongo ki te wāhine toa who have lived this, who pay the price. So I really ask you to think deeply about what they've shared with us, and I want to thank them very much. And I'm sorry we couldn't do all the questions, but you follow these women, you'll find out what life is really all about in Aotearoa. It's an exciting place to be. We have to challenge our own racism. Would anyone like to do a closing karakia from our panel?
Can I just say first, sorry, I found that last comment really offensive, the minority council thing, like that's a bit of a blow right at the end of this kōrero.
Oh, okay. Yep.
It just shows a lack of understanding. What we've been talking about is mana whenua. Even though we're a minority at the moment, that shouldn't matter because we're mana whenua.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah,
it was just someone to do this karakia.
Yeah.
I tautoko ai ngā kōrero kua kōrero tia e tuhi au koera hoki tāku ko ngai tātou ngā iwi Māori te mano o tēnei whenua, kei a mātou taua whiringa, kei a mātou te iwi Māori taua kōrero me pēhea ka tū rangatira I runga I a tātou I a mātou ake whenua. I runga I tēnā, koera te kōrero, koera te kōrero, koera tēnei kaupapa, ne. So that's why we're all here. That's the kōrero that's been put before us, is that at the end of the day, it's down to the mana whenua to make the call about how we are represented and where we choose and the pathway that we choose to define our rangatiratanga and carve the pathway to rangatiratanga on our own land. So I offer the opening karakia, I'll offer the closing karakia, and thank you very much, Catherine, for your for holding us today in this discussion, and thank you everybody for their attendance. He mihi anō tēnei ki a koutou katoa I ngā wāhine. Tēnei te maurika hiki iho ki te whenua e takoto nei a Papatuanuku. He rangi atua, he rangi tipua, he rangi tawhito, I whiti ko te matauranga, I tau ko te māramatanga tēnei ka hikitea kia wātea, haumie, hui e, tai
Kia ora.
Tēnā koutou, mauri ora.